Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Thursday, July 31st, 2025, and on Thursdays we talk about knowledge and science. But because it's July 31st, quick shout out, my bestie, best man at our wedding. It's his birthday. Happy birthday, Tony. Great guy. And yeah, ended up getting his MD. He was still 23 when he earned his medical degree. Pretty smart dude. Okay, so let's talk about empathy then from a more scientific perspective, shall we? So evolution has certainly shaped the human brain to be sensitive to and to be responsive to the emotional states of others, but especially our offspring, our family, the members of one's own social group, however that might be defined. But even advanced forms of empathy in humans build upon older forms and remain connected to the physiological and neurohormonal mechanisms that are associated with emotional communication, with social attachments, and perhaps in some ways, most importantly, with parental care. But at the same time, the capacity for empathy is shaped further by language, by the theory of the mind and our executive functioning, and obviously by social norms and values. And these vary to some degree across cultures. But the more expanded capacities that we have allow us as human beings to be empathetic towards others beyond the immediacy of our kinship and our kin members and our in-group members. And that in some ways sets us apart. I don't think makes us unique in nature, but humans obviously occupy a very distinctive niche, and that capacity for empathy is beyond the immediacy of kin and relatives is part and parcel of what distinguishes us as human beings. And by the way, it's not to say that empathy has actually been observed or measured or determined. It seems to exist in other species as well, in other animals, even rodents and ravens, among others, indicating that there are some neurobiological mechanisms that operate across many species. So the full-fledged experience, though, of human empathy is, again, sort of what distinguishes us. And it really means, for example, that the child, even a young child, understands that she's a distinct person from the others that are around her, and who can then recognize the feelings that she has and the feelings of others, and can regulate her own emotional responses, can read the cues, so to speak, and respond appropriately. And so empathy also means then that even a young child can adopt someone else's perspective to some degree and can imagine the types of behavior, for example, that might help another person to feel better, to comfort them. And yet there's a great deal of learning involved with empathy as well. The development of empathy relies on the progressive maturation of our brain circuits and the neural representations that are constructed through this iterative and reciprocal patterns of interactions that we experience in our environments. And so here's the key point in this sense. Early emotional experiences, especially between babies and their caregivers, are absolutely essential for the emergence and development of empathy. And so, for example, the children who are securely attached then to their caregivers, therefore feeling loved as well, are subsequently more sensitive to the emotional needs of others. And conversely, I can bet, or I would hypothesize, that the vast majority of cases where somebody's lacking the capacity to show empathy, and especially on the more psychological or psychotic end of the spectrum, that probably can be traced back, or at least in most cases, to a relative lack of connectedness to a primary caregiver as infants. If you look at the research and you look at the early sensitivity that people are able to display, it's remarkable how very young we are when we can actually start responding to distress cues. And we have a certain almost aversion to interpersonal harm. Again, most of us. Again, perhaps if somebody's suffered a brain injury or has some other neurocognitive impairment, well then, yeah, that might be the exception. But generally speaking, the neuroscience and the behavioral evidence indicates that the human brain seems to be innately wired to process, or at least readily learn to distinguish the pro-social from the antisocial behaviors, the helping from the hurtful behaviors. And then that extends then to our capacity to develop empathy. And so from birth, it's remarkable, but infants are sensitive to emotional signals that are informative about the internal affective states of others. And you can just look at the different studies, the research that's been done in terms of neurohemodynamic activity in the insula and in the orbitofrontal cortex. And even if you just look at the general responses, the facial and the emotional responses to infants when they are shown or when they encounter faces of those who are upset or who withdraw emotion and connectedness, and how that makes them respond. We can look at the still face experiments as another example of that. And so it's incredible. But infants as young as 12 months then start to be able to comfort victims of distress in their own way, obviously. And by 14 to 18 months old, children display spontaneous and unrewarded helping behaviors. And at the same time, though, the differences in infants' sensitivity to the other's emotional needs also indicate that those who are, or reaffirm that those who are more securely attached to their caregivers demonstrate greater sensitivity. So even from this very, very young age, even before 2 years old, and those lacking in the attachments will tend to be less able or display less often emotionally sensitive responses to distressed situations. So we have a neurocapacity then for empathy. There's no question about that. But we also tend to rely upon others to learn how to respond. And this is a notion, well, it's kind of referred to as simulation theory, whereas we begin to simulate. If we're exposed to others and their examples, we then develop or we start to simulate and replicate what they do and internalize that to become our more fully empathetic selves. And so empathy is possible then because we see others experiencing and displaying an emotion and then simulate and represent the same emotion in ourselves. So we can sort of feel what that feels like firsthand, shall we say. And there's a clear biological component operating here. The scientists who have studied these issues have, for example, discovered preliminary evidence of mirror, like the mirror in the, you look at your face in the mirror neurons that fire when human beings observe and experience emotion. So we know that there's this incredibly fine-tuning aspect of our neurobiology that influences how we respond. And there's also the parts of the brain in the prefrontal cortex that are responsible for our higher learning or kinds of thought that show overlap of activation for both self-focused and other-focused thoughts and judgments. So there seems to be some parallel firing that's going on there. And so then empathetic concern, the motivation to care for the well-being of others, starts to gradually develop more and more and really comes to the fore even by the second year of a person's young life. And most importantly, the recent research demonstrates that empathetic behaviors are then influenced consistently by the reciprocal interactions that we have within our social environments. So it's as though we're getting reinforced and stimulated and then, rinse and repeat. And through these ongoing iterative processes, we learn to become increasingly sensitive to the needs and the feelings of others. If we're denied that opportunity, if we don't have examples of that, if we don't see evidence of that, if we're raised in relative isolation or we don't have regular social contacts, we demonstrably lack displays of empathy. We're not developing the neural pathways that allow us then to express empathy the way we would normally expect people to, or at least in our common experiences. And then there are, of course, the cognitive components of empathy, which we've talked about a little bit this week as well, which allow us to, sort of see inside the mind of the other person, or at least begin to adopt the other person's point of view. And this is functionally related to our executive functioning of our brains, the theory of the mind, And this seems to emerge around age 3. Again, there's no fixed timeline, but most of the neurodevelopment occurs within regular stages, shall we say. And then finally, or I should say fully materializes by the time a child is about 6 to 7 years old. And so at that point, we really expect most children, nearly all children, again, under normal circumstances, to be able to display fully a range of empathetic behaviors and responses to other people's pain and suffering or distress and so on. Again, if a child isn't displaying that, we might want to ask why. What's happening? What's happening in the background? What's happening with their family? What's happening neurologically, etc. Okay, so, and then even if the ability to regulate our emotions then develops rapidly, which it does, I mean, in the first few years of our lives, there are still in additional linkages that have to be made in terms of our executive functioning, and that really depends on the maturation, the development of the prefrontal cortex. Again, for most people, that's not an issue. Things develop regularly and naturally, and in the normal phase of development, and they respond quite typically to situations of stress or distress. But at the same time, as we get older, the theory of mind indicates that our executive functioning starts to play a more important role as we mature. So the ability to understand what another person is thinking and feeling is also based then on the rules, the cultural norms and so forth that we internalize. And that's why we do see cross-cultural variation. Every culture displays empathy or has different displays of it, but the appropriate context within which to display that empathy does vary, not because of the neurochemistry, but because of the different kinds of cultural rules and social expectations that do differ to some degree across different societies. Okay, so yeah, basically, there's no clear consensus, but we're fully convinced, though, that the development of empathy includes both this neuropsychological aspect as well as a cognitive component. And both seem to begin to operate almost seamlessly, or they become interwoven as we get older, and they become an almost automatic or natural emotional response that is accompanied by our learned conceptual reasoning to make sense out of what it is that we're observing. And so depending on the context of the situation, you might have one or both types of empathetic responses, both the emotional and the cognitive, simultaneously triggered, okay? But sometimes it's more one or more the other. Interestingly, while both environmental and genetic influences shape a person's ability then to empathize, we actually tend to maintain a fairly stable empathetic disposition across our lifespans. That is, our levels of empathy the evidence seems to suggest, doesn't really change over the course of our lifetimes. So in other words, whatever you were and however you were and how you were responding, and did it upset you when people stepped on ants when you were 6 or 7? Well, you probably have that same disposition 10, 20, 30, 40 years later as well. Okay? And conversely, if you didn't care, if you were the kid who was putting the magnifying glass up to the ants, to burn them or whatever whatever you might have been doing, there's a good chance that you, again, have less empathy all these years later, right? Or you have a more difficult time, shall we say, expressing empathy. Okay, but that's not to say that you can't change at all. But our levels of empathy seem to be remarkably stable, almost like our core personality traits. We don't really change that dramatically. I mean, we can work at it, we can try, but our capacity to empathize doesn't really change all that much as we age either. And the good news is that we also don't typically see age-related declines in empathy, short of having a brain injury or a disease, right? And the evidence consistently shows that empathy is associated with higher levels of positive engagement and health and well-being. So people who are more empathetic tend to do better in life. All right. And at the other end, of course, are the people, and there are some people out there who are just miserable. Or in this case, or this context, I'm talking about how they seem to lack in basic empathy and compassion for others. And again, that's also not likely to change much, especially if that's the way they are in adulthood. So to conclude, it's almost certainly true then that we likely feel empathy in the first instance due to the evolutionary advantages that displaying empathy affords us. And so empathy is probably evolved, especially in the context of the parental care that characterizes all mammals. Signaling their state through smiling and through crying and so on, human infants are essentially compelling their caregivers to take some kind of action, to respond. And females who responded to their offspring's needs out-reproduced, on average, those who were more cold and distant, at least according to the research. And this might help explain some of the gender differences that we observe in empathy. So again, while we have a natural predisposition to developing empathy, social and cultural factors also strongly influence where and how and for whom that empathy might be expressed. And so empathy is something that we develop over time and in relationship to our social environment, becoming such a complex response that it's hard to recognize its origin in simpler responses, such as body mimicry, for example. But at the same time, we're very good then at recognizing when there's a relative lack of empathy being expressed, partly because of our hardwiring, and partly because it's quite shocking when we're expecting empathy in a social context or because of our sociocultural backgrounds, and then it just doesn't appear. Wait, what? It's kind of like saying I love you to someone, and then waiting and waiting and waiting for the response. You're supposed to say it, I love you back, right? Okay, all right. Well, that's it for today. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. A brief, hurried review of some of what we know from the neuropsychological perspective on empathy. And so tomorrow we'll talk about the cultural justifications and context surrounding empathy a bit further. All right, as ever, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs and empathy in abundance. We'll see you soon.